Welcome to our Musica Sacra concert for the spring of 2021. We'll be performing two works in the concert that you will hear. The first is Stabat Mater, a sacred work for two singers and strings by a composer that we know as Giovanni Battista Pergolesi. Now, first things first, his last name really wasn't Pergolesi. His last name was actually Draghi, D-R-A-G-H-I. He's known as Pergolesi because that is an Italian adjective describing that he was from the town of Pergola in Italy. The other thing about, we will call him Pergolesi because everyone does, he died remarkably young. He lived from 1710 to 1736. Now, there aren't too many major composers that we know about who died at the age of 26, but Pergolesi certainly is one. At 1725, we know he was a student at the Naples Conservatory, and most of his work that he did from then on was in the Italian city of Naples. He wrote operas, he wrote instrumental music, he wrote orchestral music, chamber music, and he wrote sacred music as well. Now, a couple of quick things. We talk about the Baroque era in music, and the dates that we usually give for that are 1600 to 1750. Now, two reasons. Music historians, music teachers, music students love nice round numbers, and 1600 is a beautiful round number. 1750 is also, but 1750 in addition is the year that Johann Sebastian Bach died. Bach is the consummate master of Baroque German music. So very often we see the end of the Baroque era right around 1750. But in reality, it started shifting much earlier, particularly in Italy, where Pergolesi worked. So around the 1720s to the 1730s, now think, that's the period when Pergolesi is writing. He starts writing in a style that's slightly different. He knows Baroque music. He studied Baroque music, and as we'll see in a moment, he can write Baroque music perfectly. But he also writes with this style that we call the galant style. It's kind of a transitional style between Baroque music and the next era, the classical era in music. And some of the characteristics are simpler melodies, simpler harmonies, less polyphony. If you've listened to the music of Bach, you know that he loves to have one melody start in one part, and then another instrument or another voice part will take the same melody on a different pitch. The music will imitate itself in the melodic lines. Well, you hear some of that in Pergolesi, but not most of the time. He writes with this stile galant, this gallant style. So the work you will hear, the Stabat Mater, is in many, many ways a transitional work, okay, between this later Baroque era and the oncoming classical era. Now, as I said, he can write Baroque music. When you listen to the very opening movement, it is steeped in the language of Baroque music. You're going to hear what we call a walking bass line. The bass line just keeps moving while the other instruments and voices hold their notes out. The bass line keeps moving. Bum, 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 bum. And over that bass line, you're going to hear the violins doing what we call suspensions. Suspension is a term that is a kind of a short term for suspended dissonance. And what happens with suspensions, you have two notes. Let's say they form a nice harmony. One note moves to create a dissonant sound. The other note moves to restore a nice clean harmony, a consonant sound. So listen carefully. Bum, 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 bum in the bass, and then the violins with these moving dissonances, dissonance, consonance, dissonance, consonance. the voices enter, they do the same thing. That is the essence of Baroque music. The suspended dissonance and the strong use of dissonance was considered at the time a way to be expressive in music. And you will hear it. It is incredibly expressive. The next movement is a soprano aria. Aria is just an Italian word for song. The mezzo-soprano doesn't sing. There's only a single singer, and it kind of sounds operatic. And Pergolesi himself wrote operas, as I said. As a matter of fact, the two compositions we best know Pergolesi for today are the Stabat Mater, probably his best-known work, and then a comic opera that he wrote that was called La Serva Padrona, and he wrote it in 1733. The Stabat Mater, a couple months before he died in 1736. By the way, he died probably of tuberculosis. So he knows opera, and so he uses this style of operatic singing. And if your initial reaction to that is, well, should you be using an operatic style in a sacred work? Well, everyone did it at the time, including the great church composer Johann Sebastian Bach. In his Lutheran church cantatas, he wrote operatic style arias all the time for his singers, very much like an aria you would hear in an opera. Bach never wrote an opera, but he wrote an operatic style in many, many of his operas. This music is gorgeous, and I think you'll hear that. The famous philosopher and writer and even composer Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the late part of the 18th century said about the first movement that I talked about with the walking bass line. This is a quote of Rousseau: "The most perfect and touching duet to come from the pen of any composer." It is indeed one of the most beautiful movements in all of Baroque music. It is not a coincidence that the sacred work that was most printed in the late 18th century was the Pergolesi Stabat Mater. It was also probably the most performed sacred work in the latter part of the 18th century. Go back and watch the film Amadeus, and you'll hear a movement from Pergolesi's Stabat Mater. The text of the Stabat Mater was probably from a Franciscan 13th century author named Jacopo da Todi. However, recent research, there was a research article published in an Italian journal in the year 2006, so fairly recent, but reported a copy of the Stabat Mater text found in an earlier collection of gradual texts belonging to a community of Dominican nuns in the Italian city of Bologna. So who knows? The text itself, you'll see translations on the screen before each movement. It's a meditation about the sorrow of Mary, the mother of Jesus, as she stays by the side of the cross as he is crucified. Reflection on her sorrow and also the sorrow and penitential needs of Christian sinners. Little known fact, Johann Sebastian Bach took this composition, Pergolesi's Stabat Mater, and made an arrangement of it with a German text, which was a translation of the penitential Psalm 51. Musicians, you might want to look up BWV, Bach Werke Verzeichnis, the catalog, 1063. If you listen to the German and then compare it with the Italian, it is almost exactly the same. He made a couple of rhythmic adjustments and things, but remarkable work. As you listen to the performance, listen to particularly the singers, okay? We have singers, two marvelous singers, Kaylee Aites and Lindsay Lang, who are specialists in early music. And this early style that they employ, listen to the beautiful ornaments that they employ to sing this. Ornaments were written throughout the music. Ornamentation was important in all of Baroque music, but the ornamentation style started to change right around this gallant style, the style galant, toward the very end of the Baroque era. And Lindsay and Cayley capture that beautifully. Listen to the way they blend their voices. You hear the same kind of ornamentation in the strings at the same time. All mid-18th century ornamentation. The other work that will be at the end of the Stabat Mater, I'm very excited to perform. It is a composer whose name is Joseph Bouillon. He lived from 1745 to 1799. He's better known as the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. And we're going to do a two-movement string quartet by him, an early work of his, in the key of C minor. Now, first things first, it's not sacred music. We're breaking our genre just a little bit. We have done other pieces, I think, of very interesting music, almost always instrumental works that are used for sacred purposes, but this particular one was not. It was meant to be just a pure instrumental piece. Now, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, he is the first known composer of African origin who wrote in classical style, the first one that we know of. He was a younger contemporary of Haydn. He was born about 13 years after Franz Joseph Haydn, and an older contemporary of Mozart. He was born 11 years before Mozart, so he comes right between those two composers, and he was born in Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, then a French colony. He was the son of a planter on Guadeloupe and his wife's African slave. He was brought to France, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, as a child, and he was educated there. He's a remarkable, not just a composer, but remarkable as a person. He was indeed a composer. He was indeed a conductor. He conducted very prominent orchestras in the French city of Paris. Where else? He was a virtuoso violinist. He wrote a number of violin concertos that are brilliant, and he played the violin part himself. That alone would have been enough, more than enough, to make him a fascinating person. He was also a very, very well-known fencer, sword fighting, fencer, believe that? And he fought in the French Revolution. Remarkable. We will perform, as I said, a two-movement string quartet. It was his Opus 1, which meant his first publication, number 4. It was the fourth of 6 string quartets in the Opus 1 publication. It was composed around 1770 and published in 1773. If you know string quartets by Haydn and Mozart that were written around that time, the genre was still being developed. If you're used to 4-movement string quartets in particular, structures and tempos that are typical by Haydn and by Mozart, this is early. They had not been codified yet, much earlier. So 2 movements. The first movement, kind of a moderate tempo. There's 2 sections. The first section is repeated. The second section is not. And then a second, very brief movement in a faster tempo. As you listen, notice the beautiful and ingenious melodic development and the beautiful way that the instruments overlap and blend together. Chevalier of Saint-Georges. You need to check out that composer. Thank you for your time and enjoy the concert.